Good morning, everybody in the audience. My name's Amanda Paul. I'm a Senior Policy Analyst at the European Policy Centre, and I would like to welcome you all to this EPC Talks Geopolitics with Ambassador Thomas Greminger. Ambassador Greminger has a long and distinguished diplomatic career. He has worked extensively on issues related to security, conflict resolution, and peace building. Since May 2021, he has been director of the Geneva Center for Security Studies. Prior to that, he was Secretary General of the OSCE. He has also held multiple other ambassadorial posts, including the Swiss representative to the OSCE, United Nations, and international organizations in Vienna. He is also the author of numerous publications and books related to conflict resolution, crisis management, and also military history. Today, we are going to be chatting about the future of multilateralism. Is it on its deathbed, or can it be revived? Or maybe is it already dead? European security, Russia's brutal war against Ukraine, the threat of WMDs, and many other things. So welcome to you this morning, Ambassador Greminger. It's really a pleasure to host you here. Before I go into the Q&A with you, you're going to make a short introductory statement on this topic. To the audience, I mean, probably I don't need to tell you this as you're very used to it, but please can you put your questions and comments either in the Q&A box, or you can click on the hand icon and we can hear you your real voice, which is always very nice. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over the floor to you, Ambassador Greminger.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Thanks for having me in this talk about geopolitics. And yes, indeed, I would like to make a few introductory remarks. And I would like to start out by stating that multilateralism was in crisis before COVID and before the war in Ukraine. COVID and the war led to a culmination of a number of negative trends that were out there before, like polarization, like unilateralism, transactionalism, like a lack of interest in arms control, to name just a few. Now multilateralism definitely faces a major stress test. And yes, in some respects, diplomacy and international organizations have failed. On the other hand, they're more needed than ever. Now it's not time to stop and analyze what went wrong. Rather, we should work urgently to end this conflict and to rescue as much of the international system as possible, and to start the planning for the post-war period. It wasn't that long ago, namely at the Astana summit in 2010, that 57 heads of state from OSCE countries reaffirmed their vision of a Euro-Atlantic and Eurasian security community stretching from Vancouver to Vladivostok. Now, what we have is a united Euro-Atlantic region, an unsettled Eurasia, and several very contested countries in between. The war is having many unintended consequences. Neutrality, for instance, is being questioned in some Western European countries, yet it is being proposed for Ukraine. The EU enlargement debate has been reopened for Ukraine, but perhaps also for the Western Balkans. Turkey's role in European security is once more back in the spotlight. And energy policies are being changed dramatically to get out of energy dependencies. The war in Ukraine is already having knock-on effects in other parts of the world. For example, in relation to food security, the hike of energy prices impacting on regime stability in the south. The crisis in Europe definitely does not occur in a vacuum. Geopolitics in other regions are having an impact on Europe. Clearly, we face the biggest challenge to European security since the Second World War. how we respond will define the security environment on our continent for decades to come. The EU is united in supporting the war, but what I ask myself is, where are the proposals for peace? I haven't heard many so far. How long can NATO countries in Ukraine rely on the American security umbrella exclusively? I think we Europeans in particular need to think and need to act to de-escalate tensions, to open negotiations and dialogue, knowing that yes, you need to tango, to reaffirm common principles and commitments to restore order based on the rule of law, and to consider the long-term consequences for Europe. And now I very much look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Greminger. I think you already raised a lot of important issues and questions that we can elaborate on a bit further now. But I want to come back to the core issue here, which is multilateralism. I mean, you mentioned very briefly some of the challenges, but I would like you to sort of, elaborate a bit on these challenges. What do you see as the biggest challenges going forward? Because I mean, it's not something new, as you have mentioned. I mean, it's been going on for a long time. The challenge to multilateralism, particularly, when it comes to the United Nations in the UN Security Council, all the different members just often, block decisions just because it doesn't suit them or it suits them. The same in the OSCE. So what do you see as the biggest challenges to really making multilateralism function as we would all like it to function?
Well, perhaps let me mention 3 points. The first and one of clearly the biggest challenges to multilateralism is a lack of respect for the rules, is violations of international law. The international order was established to create fairness, to create predictability, stability in the international system, and if that is lacking, there is no order. Not necessarily direct chaos, but it's a kind of a free-for-all. A second challenge that I would like to mention is a lack of empathy. States seem so focused on their own domestic situations that they do not think about the needs, interests, viewpoints of others. And this then results in a lack of understanding, a breakdown of trust and communication, and conflict rather than cooperation. And perhaps the third point that I would like to mention is a functioning multilateral system is not a given. It does not come about automatically. Member states, and I think this is true for any multilateral institution, member states need to be ready to invest in maintaining and in constantly reforming a multilateral institution by investing political capital and by allocating appropriate resources, both human and financial.
But I mean, what do you consider to be the the best way to mitigate these challenges, or to bring about reform of some of these institutions? I mean, the issue of reform of the United Nations has been on the table for many years. I mean, countries in Africa or in other parts of the world, have repeatedly, expressed their unhappiness about being, excluded. That, when the UN was created, the world was a different place. Now it needs to be far more representative. I mean, the UN, particularly the UN Security Council, which is, dominated by a certain number of countries.
Well, perhaps we need to start out by simply explaining better the impact of being interconnected in today's world. And maybe, people may not care about instability in a faraway country, but you will then certainly care if thousands of refugees or migrants show up in your town. Perhaps you don't care about the war in Ukraine, but you wonder why wheat and gas prices go up. And as Secretary General Guterres has said, in an interconnected world, solidarity at the end of the day is self-interest. I think that's perhaps one way. But a second point that I would like to make here, at the end of the day, you need political commitment, political leadership. You need politicians that are ready to believe in cooperative approaches to solving global problems, and thereby also ready to invest political capital in the multilateral system.
And maybe I can just ask you one further point related to this. I mean, how do you see now the challenge that is coming from, from China to the current, world order, the multilateral system? I mean, do you see that the response to China is the right one, or do you think China should be dealt with in another way? And if I could add to that, how do you view the relationship between or the ambitions of the duo, China and Russia together? I mean, how dangerous do you see this?
I think clearly we need to recognize China's role as a major power, and if China wants to be a major power, it also needs to engage in the multilateral system, needs to assume responsibility. And I think this comes along with a number of obligations, and I think that is a clear message to China in multilateral bodies. At the same time, I think we also, need to be self-confident enough to defend the values that have inspired the multilateral system as we have created it after the end of the Cold War, that is at the end of the Second World War, that is a system that is based on the rule of law, that is based on the respect for human rights and democratic institutions. I think there is obviously, and you see it also now in relation to the war in Ukraine, there is a strong political partnership that has just been very recently reaffirmed between China and the Russian Federation. But at the same time, I think there are also a lot of conflicting interests between the two, and I don't think that this partnership is a given for the medium and the long term. I think we do have, an interest to work with both of them, have identify common interests in dealing with both of them. I mean, you can see it in relation to the war in Ukraine, in the sense that China is, trying very hard to deal with this dilemma between, on the one hand, this loyalty to the political partnership with the Russian Federation, and on the other, clearly the concern that the war, the sanctions will have heavy repercussions on economic growth, on the global economy, and for China, this is an absolutely strategic policy objective to maintain high economic growth rates. And if these growth rates are endangered, then of course China becomes very worried, and and will think twice to what extent it will, stick to, let's say, commitments undertaken in the framework of a political partnership.
Thank you. I would like now to come back to the issue of European security. I mean, Europe I mean, there's a war in the heart of Europe, something that we thought, or most of us thought, would never happen at all, at least in our lifetime, I'm guessing. So what role do you now see for the OSCE in building a more secure environment? I mean, what would need to change in terms of the organization's functioning and purpose to be able to effectively do this?
I would start out by saying, of course, the OSCE is for the time being totally sidelined. I would say even crippled as a result of the war in Ukraine. But as I, alluded to in my introductory remarks, this is not something that, just now surprisingly popped up with the war. This polarization, this lack of interest of major powers in using the OSCE as a platform for serious security policy dialogue, for conflict resolutions, for discussing arms control, military risk reduction, CSPMs. This has been lacking for many years. So again, what we currently see is just a culmination of trends. Having said so, the OSCE remains a very inclusive, perhaps the only inclusive forum for dialogue that involves the United States, Russia, and the rest of Europe. It does have solid foundations of principles and commitments. And I do believe that the OSCE could play a key role in reconstructing the European security architecture, provided there is a will to use the platforms this organization could offer by key stakeholders of European security. Obviously, this is not going to happen as long as we are facing a hot war. But once the hot war ends, and we will risk to move into some sort of a Cold War, and then I think we will have to seriously consider what to undertake to get out of this looming Cold War 2.0. And I think here, again, reconsidering some approaches of cooperative security in an OSCE framework would probably be a pretty good idea. But again, it will take a lot of political commitment, and here as well, I would add, you need two to tango.
I mean, as you rightly said, I mean, the war in Ukraine, it's totally redefining the security architecture of Europe. So I'd like to ask you, when an end to this war comes, how can the international community best participate in the rebuilding of peace in Europe? And do you think that, this and the new security architecture, I mean, the rebuilding of it, that there should be, a role for Russia in this or not? I mean, depending on how, on future steps.
I think clearly after the war, the face of Europe will be scared. Deterrence will be the dominant approach in security thinking. It will take a lot of time to heal the wounds, time to rebuild some degree of confidence, but at some point, I think we need to get back to some forms of cooperative security if we want to rebuild peace and stability in Europe. So a dialogue will again become vital, and also trust-inducing actions. And clearly, in the medium to long term, security in Europe without Russia will only be partial security, can only be based on deterrence. So at some point in time, we will to bring Russia back to a European security order, provided Russia is again ready to play along the rules. But before this can happen, before we have a political environment that is ripe for such a step, Russia would have to prove this through quite some deeds, and obviously a first of such a deed would be a quick end to the current war, and an end of the war, that is acceptable to all major stakeholders of European security, including, of course, Ukraine itself.
But do you think that the West should be, preparing itself for a long-term confrontation with Russia? Should that be, at the moment, the approach of the allies? Particularly when it comes to security.
I think this is. I think we need to think in scenarios right now, and I think none of us can predict what will happen in a couple of months, in 6 months, in a year or two. I think we can have a relatively soon an end of the war with a fair outcome. We can have an end of the war with a victorious end, basically one party defining the terms of the end a bit along, Versailles of 1919. That would obviously be a bad end of the war. You can imagine an escalation of the war, but you can also imagine, and perhaps this is even the most likely scenario right now, that there is at some point something like an unstable ceasefire, and we will, without any major political agreement, and we will kind of revive something of the kind that we have seen since 2014, with a line of contact that is farther to the west. So a kind of a unfinished partition of the country, perhaps insurgencies in the occupied part of the country. So this is also a scenario that we should have in our mind when we plan for the future. So thinking in scenarios, I think, is something that we should do. But again, if we want to bring back a perspective of peace and stability to European security in the long run, we will need to bring Russia back to a pan-European security system, and so I would currently clearly defend an approach of resolve, of deterrence towards the Russian Federation, but strategies to systematically and sustainably weaken Russia, to marginalize Russia, these kinds of strategy, I think, are counterproductive and not conducive to long-term peace and stability in Europe.
But is it not the case that in order to ensure, or as much as we can possibly ensure, that Russia will never again launch this sort of war, that Ukraine needs to have a decisive victory, and in this respect, it's important for the support to continue to come, and arms, sanctions, and whatnot from the allies, because any other ending which would sort of leave any gaps in spaces could be manipulated or used again in the future by the Russians.
I think that's what I said before. I think we need an approach that is characterized by a strong resolve to protect Ukraine. An approach that also clearly, signals that in the 21st century, a military invasion of a country is unacceptable. Changing borders by military means is unacceptable. I think this is very important. At the same time, in the medium to long term, I think we need to come up with a security order where everybody will find its place, and that is true for all those states that happen to be geographically in between NATO and the Russian Federation, but it is also true for the Russian Federation. And I think this implies that we get back to the principles of European security, and in an attempt to again come to an understanding, a common understanding, what these principles mean in the 21st century. And this also implies that we are ready to openly acknowledge the dilemmas that these principles bring along, and try to deal with these dilemmas, reconcile these dilemmas. And I think a classical dilemma is the one of these bridge states, these states in between, where you see the dilemma between, on the one hand, the right of these states to freely choose their security arrangements, but on the other, you obviously have also the principle of the indivisibility of security, so that no state, should increase its own security at the expense of another. And if you apply these principles to the states in between, I think you immediately see that you have a challenge that can only be resolved by dialogue, and eventually a political commitment to reconcile these principles.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'd like now to turn to the role of the EU in terms of European security, because we've seen since the beginning of this brutal war, there has been sort of a change in the approach of the EU when it comes to its own security and defense policies. But how do you see the EU? I mean, do you think the EU is capable of guaranteeing peace and prosperity in Europe, or will the United States always need to have the key role, the major role here? I mean, are we ever going to arrive at a time when Washington isn't the main actor responsible for our security?
Well, I believe that the EU is certainly capable of promoting peace and prosperity, at least among its members. I'm a bit less sure that it is able, and perhaps not even aspires to provide security guarantee to non-members. And the current US administration, contrary to the doubts that we had about the previous, the current seems willing to provide a security umbrella. But again, we do not know about the future. We do not know what's going to happen after the current administration. So, but then I would also, argue that we should not only think of security in terms of military power. There is, of course, this tendency to now exclusively focus on hard security, on military means. But I think Europe faces also quite a number of other threats and challenges. I mean, pandemics, we've just lived through one, migration, climate change, organized crime, violent extremism, and so dealing with these issues will require wider international cooperation, and I think it is important that the European regional organization, the EU, is capable in responding to these challenges as well.
Thank you. I'm now going to take a couple of the questions that we had coming in. The first one is from Jan von Herf, who's asking, multilateralism is based on the rule of law. The EU is increasingly utilizing access to its internal market to pursue international policy goals beyond economics. Is this undermining the EU's credibility as an advocate of multilateral rule of law approaches, as this seems to resemble more the rule of the jungle?
Well, yeah, good question. I think there is not no easy answer. I think, of course, if we want to defend multilateralism, we also need to be credible in playing along the rules. At the same time, I think we should also not be naive, and if the EU wants to be a recognized regional and global player, it will also have to engage some of its assets and provide incentives. And in that sense, I think within limits, I wouldn't see a contradiction, and I wouldn't go as far as arguing that this is then basically taking us to the law of the jungle. I think this is in a way legitimate power politics.
Great. I have a second question here from a Mr. Adrian Hatch, who's asking about France's seat on the Security Council, and putting the question, would it be a good approach for European security if France would give up their permanent seat to the European Council? Would that be beneficial?
I mean, Security Council reform is, I think, is in dire need. But I think we are under no illusion that something very substantive is going to happen in the near future, giving a role to the EU in the UN Security Council. I think is an interesting idea, definitely worth pursuing in the long term, and it would definitely be more in line with current realities, given the role the EU plays in and wants to play in global politics. So I would, pursue it as a vision, but be realistic about the short-term chances of realizing such a reform. It would obviously then, of course, also trigger the question of what about other, important regional organizations like the AU, and yeah, so eventually would probably then take us to a setup where we would have to reserve a number of seats to the most relevant international regional organizations in the Security Council. I think per se a concept that would make sense to me.
Okay, thank you. I want to now come back to the security situation in Europe, and let's touch a bit on the threat that's been made about using weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear arms. How do you see this? Do you think it's something that could actually really happen? I mean, let's say if the Russians find themselves in a position of losing the war, is it really likely that they could use a nuclear weapon or another type of WMD?
Well, that's obviously a very important question. I must say I had yesterday the privilege of facilitating a discussion among leading American and Russian experts on exactly these issues. And I think the sense that I got from this discussion is that there is, on the one hand, no immediate risk of a nuclear escalation, including through tactical nuclear weapons, but there is still a reason to be worried. And on the one hand, we have heard a lot of nuclear saber rattling over the last 3 months, a lot of loose talk, and I think this is clearly not reassuring. It's not reassuring also populations in Europe, and what also needs to acknowledge is the war has raised the risk of a direct Russian-NATO confrontation. There is no doubt about that. And at the same time, for a nuclear escalation to happen, it would take a number of intermediate steps to get there. But the risk of a confrontation is clearly bigger than before. In that sense, I would remain worried, even though I don't see an immediate risk of nuclear escalation.
I mean, do you think enough is being done, to mitigate this threat? I've read, a multilateral level or at a bilateral level. I mean, diplomacy that's being carried out between, different countries in the region. For example, the diplomacy now that's being carried out or from Turkey, I mean, over the war in Ukraine with Russia. I mean, how do you see this?
I think there can never be enough diplomacy, but I mean, clearly there is communication between the militaries of the US and the Russian Federation. There is talk among experts. Unfortunately, the strategic stability dialogue, that was the bilateral platform between the US and the Russian Federation that allowed to talk about nuclear, hypersonic, non-proliferation, space, new technologies. This platform is suspended. I hope not abandoned for good, suspended. So I think it is very important that there is talk in perhaps more through more confidential channels, that there is talk among experts to kind of also provide mutual reassurances. When it comes to resolving the conflict, I think we are all grateful for Turkey's facilitation efforts. At the same time, we recognize that for the time being, political negotiations have been suspended. There are some negotiations on a more tactical level on the grain corridors. There is negotiations on what is happening to the Azov prisoners, but the political negotiations, they're suspended for the time being. There seems to be a sense by the sides that one first needs to, find out who wins the battle of the Donbass before there is a readiness to come back to the negotiation table. I acknowledge that, but of course I regret it.
Yeah, I think we all do. I would like to, as we only have a few minutes left, I would like to put the last question to you about your organization, because the GCSP, I mean, it's working on security related issues, conflict resolution. So can you elaborate a bit what role you see for your organization in participating in the future of security, or some of the initiatives perhaps that you are working on or want to focus on now related to the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, with great pleasure. We basically offer three different products. On the one hand, we're a capacity builder. We offer executive education. We educate experts and leaders to deal with the challenges of change. We play a role in early warning and strategic forecasting. We try to provide joined up thinking and to understand complex issues and the links between them. So that's basically the capacity building pillar. A second pillar is we provide safe spaces for dialogue, track 2, track 1.5, dialogues on issues of geopolitical relevance, but also issues related to global governance or regional peace process related dialogues. I think that is an important function, in particular in a very polarized world, that there are still spaces available where people can gather safely, and also people that are non-like-minded. And that's very much how we see ourselves, as a place where also non-like-minded can gather and discuss and perhaps identify cooperations. And thirdly, we focus on research and policy advice in a number of important security policy areas. Here I would like to mention emerging disruptive technologies, cyber, but also arms control. The nexus between environment, climate, and security is something that we focus on. Strategic anticipation and foresight is a strength of the center, and perhaps also crisis management and leadership as cross-cutting approaches. That's in a few words what we are trying to contribute to promoting peace and stability.
Okay, thank you so much. I mean, we've come to the end of our session. So I would like to thank you very much for joining us today, Ambassador Greminger, for covering numerous issues, which has really displayed your vast area of expertise, talking about the future of multilateralism, the war in Ukraine, European security, all of these issues that really deserve to be much more elaborated on. So thank you again. It was really a pleasure to host you, and we look forward to cooperating with you again in the future. Thank you so much, and a good afternoon to all the colleagues watching.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Thank you.
Thank you.